groups of friends, people who've gone to school to one another. This is a diagram of the Bali attack, the different operations groups, the suicide bombers and whatnot. The dark circles means that everybody within that dark circle has known everyone else and is thickly related to everyone else. Otherwise, you'd have, many more ties. And what we find is the red guys, they all taught or studied at the Lukmanul school in Malaysia, which was set up after they were kicked out of Indonesia. The gray group is the guys who had Afghan ties, who weren't in any of the madrasas. The Al-Mukmin ties, the yellow guys, is another madrasa founded by the father of 3 of the Bali plotters. The Al-Mukmin ties, that's the original madrasa founded by Abu Bakr Bashir. 17 of the 27 Bali bomb plotters went to the same schools. Now, you look at this and you say, like our Secretary of State and our Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of Defense, that means madrasas are dangerous. No, it does not mean madrasas are dangerous. There are tens of thousands of madrasas. We're talking about 3 that are responsible for all the attacks. It's a little bit like saying, you had Columbine, you had Virginia Tech, let's close down the American high schools and universities. Now, this is a very small group that are responsible for these kinds of actions. This is a study we did. So far as I know, the only study ever done of madrasas themselves. We did a comparative study of madrasas, and we find that the ones associated with Jama'ah Islamiyah really are different. Okay? So here's a typical example we try to use. When we do surveys, we do them as experimental designs. We don't do attitude surveys. So we ask questions they've never heard of before, and they have to form inferences and responses on the spot. So one of the questions we ask, for example, if a child who is born of Jewish Zionists is raised since birth by Jama'ah Islamiyah, will it grow up to be Jama'ah Islamiyah or Jewish Zionist? Now, when we ask this to people in the Christian identity movement, for example, we get terribly racist, essentialist responses. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew, a Zionist is a Zionist is a Zionist, that's the way God made them. It doesn't matter who raises them. These guys are different. Most Muslim groups, including, for example, the Hamas or the Hezbollah, or even most Al-Qaeda will say, no, he'll grow up to be a Muslim. In fact, an Al-Qaeda Muslim if he's raised by Al-Qaeda, which is the right way. This is one of the few groups that doesn't believe that. So there are some startling differences. These are just diagrams of what the school connections are between the guys in the classes when they went to high school. Another set of connections, school connections between the major attack leaders. Again, they crisscross the organizational structure in every which way. Again, more school connections. And now I'd like to go over to the Madrid attack. The Madrid bombing by a bunch of radical students and hangers-on, drug traffickers, small-time dealers in stolen goods, and other sorts of petty criminals, improbably succeeded precisely because it was most improbable. There was no ingenious cell structure, no hierarchy, no recruitment, no brainwashing, no coherent organization, no links to Al-Qaeda, yet this half-baked plot, concocted in a few months, with a target suggested over the internet, was the proximate cause of regime change in a democratic society. So, that's an interesting problem. How could so few cause such havoc? Not only so few, but basically a few nincompoops. These were mostly losers who got incredibly lucky. Most of these guys are caught. These guys made it. Some of them were fairly smart. But the plot itself, when we go through it, is so improbable, so unlikely, where most of the people didn't have any idea what the other guys were doing, and it worked precisely because of that. The police were informed of what was going on with every part of the plot since its inception and before. Yet they were never able to put it together. So what we have back in the early 1990s, we have up here a group of small-time Spanish criminal losers. They go to jail because they're selling dynamite to fishermen to blow up fish, which is illegal. They're stealing dynamite from the dynamite mine where they work, Las Conchitas. This woman, Carmen Toro, she's the sister of this guy, Antonio Toro, who is the cellmate of this guy, Trashores, Emilio Trashores, and she will eventually marry Trashores. They also happen to be cousins to begin with. You got a bunch of Salafis who are actually frustrated Muslim brothers who fled Syria after Hafiz al-Assad in the late 1980s cracked down on the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. And they fled as refugees to Spain. They were indicted for involvement in the 9/11 plot by Baltazar Garzón, but they were, since their conviction was since overturned by the Spanish Supreme Court, basically had nothing to do with it. These guys, they're all became petty drug dealers from the same neighborhood in a small, tumble-down place called the Jamak Mezouak in Tetuan, northern Morocco, which is right near the Spanish enclave of Ceuta. Nothing changes here. Now, some Moroccan students and one Tunisian, an economics student who got a scholarship to study for a PhD, an honors student, hook up after mosque with some of the Salafis that had come from Damascus. These guys are three brothers from Tetuan, all drug addicts. This guy, he's a sort of little Napoleon. It's more like James Cagney in Public Enemy. I mean, a tough little guy who you don't mess around with. But he's also a drug addict. He meets a girl, Rosa, a Spanish girl on a park bench, who's a crack addict in 1992. She's 13 years old. He's very ugly, and she says, basically, I don't want to talk to anyone as ugly as you are. But he sticks around anyway, and eventually she becomes his girl. She becomes pregnant, and while she's 5 months pregnant, he decides he's going to kick his heroin habit. He does it by turning to religion. And if you follow people who've actually kicked their heroin addicts, the only ones who can do it really cold turkey are usually those guys who find religion. Otherwise, they really need medical help. Anyway, he's successful. He goes to his friends, fellow drug pushers, the three. Two of the three decide to kick the habit with him. And they become his lifelong friends and his bodyguards. This is his cousin, who also doesn't kick the habit. Okay, the original group of Salafis from Syria, together with the students from Morocco and the one Tunisian, start meeting at this river and having picnics on the Navalcarnero River in the late 1990s. They start singing jihadi songs. They start chanting, playing soccer together, deciding that they have to do something. They have no idea what to do. And so they start forming new connections. Let me go back. They start forming a thick set of connections, of friends, of family, of guys they meet at the cultural association, in the mosque, at the barber shop, at the butcher shop. It's really hard to get through the thick set of relationships that are involved, but they start forming a thick community. By the way, this guy Cartagena, he's a police informant who's part of the group, who's reporting as this is going on the whole time. They start calling themselves El Harakat al-Salafiyya, which means the Salafi movement. They also start calling themselves Takfir wal Hijra, after the old Takfiri movement. But again, mostly they just talk and scream and yell and run around and play soccer and have picnics together. And they're going to do this until right before the plot is hatched, because they really have no idea what to do. Meanwhile, this guy who's a jewel thief and a male strip dancer and a bouncer, he gets thrown into jail with these two guys who are the guys selling the dynamite to the fishermen. He gets thrown in the same cell. He's got a friend, Aglif, who's called the Rabbit. The Rabbit happens to be one of the messengers for the drug guys who have since moved to Madrid from Tetuan. The police release Zuhair, who's playing all sides of the game, and his police handler named Victor says, look, you go back to Asturias, that's the northern Spanish town, where you were in prison with Trasores and Toro, the two Spanish losers who were selling dynamite, and you try to find out who's their new market. So Zuhair goes back up in Asturias. There's no one really who's a market. He starts talking to his friend Aglif. They used to go to these whorehouses on the outskirts of Madrid. And Aglif says, well, my friend who just got out of prison, he had Jamal Ahmidan, this little sort of public enemy James Cagney type. He had been put in prison for murder. He had knifed some guy, killed him. But then he paid off the family and was eventually released. Besides, he was so tough, no one wanted to testify against him. He comes back in late July 2003 to Spain. He starts schmoozing around with Aglif, who says, hey, by the way, there's a guy I know, Zuhair, who's trying to get rid of some dynamite. Now, meanwhile, Ahmidan has